She had a billion-dollar empire, a corner office on the 68th floor, and a blank check that had never failed her, until the day she crashed into a man who refused to take it. What happens when the most powerful woman in New York meets the one thing her money cannot buy, a father's love for his son, and a truth so devastating it could destroy everything she ever built? This is not a love story. This is a story about what a woman has to burn down before she can finally become human again. Stay until the very end. Hit like and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Victoria Vance turned 32, she did not eat breakfast. Not because she was dieting, not because she forgot, but because breakfast required sitting still, and Victoria Vance had not sat still in 11 years. Not since her father's funeral, when she had perched at the edge of the front pew in a black Chanel dress, dry-eyed and already calculating how long the reception would take before she could get back to the office. That was who she was. That was who she had made herself. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her 68th floor Manhattan penthouse at 5:47 in the morning, a cup of black coffee going cold in one hand, her phone lighting up with 46 unread emails in the other. Below her, the city was a gray smear of headlights and ambition. She had once loved that view. She could not remember when she had stopped. Her assistant, a sharp-boned young woman named Priya, who survived entirely on iced coffee and anxiety, had left a printed briefing on the kitchen counter. Victoria read it while walking. She read everything while walking. Stillness was a vulnerability she could not afford. The summary was surgical and grim. The board of directors had scheduled an emergency session for Friday. Her uncle Roland, her father's younger brother, and the company's second-largest shareholder had been collecting proxy votes quietly for the last 3 months. 3 independent board members had already shifted their allegiance. The tipping point was the Whitmore contract, a $1.4 billion government initiative to develop a family-centric community development zone in upstate New York. The Federal Review Committee had published their preliminary scoring criteria the previous week. The language was unmistakable. Community investment, family values, human-centered leadership. Victoria had stared at that phrase for a long time. Human-centered. She had underlined it and written a single word beneath it in her perfect architectural handwriting. Translate. Priya had flagged the core problem in a bullet point at the bottom of the briefing because Priya understood that Victoria processed bad news better when it was delivered without sentiment. The committee's public profile of their ideal contractor described a leader with a demonstrated commitment to family, community, and personal accountability. Victoria's public profile included 3 hostile takeovers, a famously leaked internal memo where she had referred to her own marketing department as decorative overhead, and a viral photograph of her walking past a homeless man outside her building while speaking on the phone, her expression as indifferent as winter concrete. The tabloids had given her a nickname 2 years ago, the Ice Architect. She wore it like a medal. Roland had called her last Thursday. The conversation had lasted 4 minutes. "You have until your birthday, Victoria Thiom," he had said. His voice carried the particular warmth of a man who had always resented her father for loving her more than him, and who had spent 2 decades waiting for a moment exactly like this one. "The birthday clause in your father's trust is airtight. If you cannot demonstrate to the satisfaction of the independent board members that you are a leader capable of representing the values this contract requires, I will have the votes to trigger the dilution clause. You will lose your majority, and then, my dear, you will lose the company." She had hung up without responding. She had then walked to her bathroom, gripped the edge of the marble sink, looked at herself in the mirror for a long time, and thought with absolute clarity, "I will not lose this company." She had been saying that sentence in one form or another since she was 21 years old. It had gotten her through her father's diagnosis, the hostile board members who had tested her in those first brutal years, the lawsuit from a former VP who had called her unprofessional on his way out the door, and found himself facing a legal team that turned his retirement into a negotiation he deeply regretted. She had built Vance Holdings from a mid-size real estate firm into a vertically integrated development empire with assets on 3 continents. She had done it alone. She had done it by being the most prepared, most controlled, most ruthless person in every room she entered. Now the room was asking her to be something else. She set down her cold coffee, picked up her car keys, and left. The thing about driving in New York at 6 in the morning was that it gave you the illusion of control. The streets were not yet choked, the light had not yet turned mean, and if you drove a Porsche 911 Carrera in graphite gray, you could sometimes feel for a few minutes at a time that the city belonged to you. Victoria had a driver. She used him for evenings and airports. Mornings she drove herself because mornings were the only hour she did not have to perform anything for anyone. She was on the Brooklyn Bridge when Priya called, and she was already reaching for the phone when she looked up and saw the delivery truck stopped dead in the right lane, its hazard lights blinking slow orange pulses in the pre-dawn gray. She hit the brake, not quite hard enough. The Porsche kissed the truck's rear bumper with a sound that was almost polite, a soft, expensive crunch of carbon fiber and aluminum, and then everything went very still. For a moment, Victoria simply sat there, both hands braced against the steering wheel, her heart slamming against her ribs, the hazard lights of the truck blinking orange, orange, orange in a rhythm that seemed almost mocking. She was unhurt. She assessed this the way she assessed quarterly reports systematically top to bottom and confirmed it. Unhurt. Then she got out of the car. The truck was old. That was her first impression. Not vintage, charming old, but working hard and tired old. The kind of old that meant someone had kept something running far past the point where they could reasonably afford to replace it. The paint on the rear panel had faded from white to a color that might have been called weathered cream. There was a hand-lettered sign taped above the bumper. Thorne and Son Woodworks, Brooklyn NY. The driver was already out. He was tall. That was her second impression, immediate and slightly inconvenient. Not the polished, gym-sculpted tall of the men who populated her professional world, but the kind of tall that came from physical work, from lifting and carrying and building things that resisted a largeness that was entirely functional and therefore in a city obsessed with aesthetics somehow startling. He wore a dark green canvas jacket, paint-worn jeans, and boots that had clearly been expensive once and were now simply reliable. His hands, she noticed, were large and calloused, the hands of someone who made things. He was looking at the rear of his truck, and then he was looking at her. "Are you hurt?" he said. His voice was level, not angry, not performatively calm in the way that people were calm when they were managing the early stages of anger. Simply level the way a carpenter's plank was level. Factual. "I'm fine," Victoria said, and her own voice came out the way it always did, clear and cool as a closing argument. "I apologize for the contact. My insurance will cover any damage to your vehicle. I'll have my assistant send a car to handle the logistics. If you can provide your details, we can resolve this immediately." She reached into her coat and produced a card. Not her personal card, her Vance Holdings card, the one with the embossed V that her assistant had once described as looking like it could cut glass. The man looked at the card. He did not take it. "The truck is fine," he said. "It's not the truck I'm concerned about." Victoria had been prepared for anger. She had been prepared for a damages negotiation. She had been prepared for the particular kind of performative outrage that people sometimes deployed when they sensed an opportunity. She was not prepared for the man to turn away from her walk to the passenger side of his truck and open the door. The boy was 7, maybe 8. He was small for his age, which Victoria would learn later, and he had his father's dark, steady eyes and a smear of something across his left cheek that might have been chocolate frosting. He was wearing a jacket 2 sizes too big for him. He was clutching a white box in his lap with the concentration of someone carrying something irreplaceable. The box had been crushed on one side. Not destroyed, but crushed. The lid had caved in at the corner, and through the crumpled cardboard edge, Victoria could see the ruin of what had clearly been a layered cake. White frosting, blue decorations, a smear of what had been writing now illegible. The boy was looking at the box. He was not crying. He was doing something that Victoria found unexpectedly and uncomfortably much worse than crying. He was sitting very still, looking at the ruined cake with the patient private grief of a child who has already learned that certain disappointments do not require an audience. "Leo," the man said, his voice dropping into a register that was entirely different from the one he had used with her. Quieter and more careful, the way you spoke to someone you loved when they were hurt. "You okay, bud?" The boy nodded once, a small economical movement that said yes with a precision that made it clear he had been taught to be brave about things that cost him something. Victoria stood on the bridge in the early morning light with her Vance Holdings card still extended in her hand and felt for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, genuinely uncertain. "Is the child injured?" she asked. "No," the man said. He was gently lifting the boy down from the cab. "Leo made that cake for my birthday. He's been working on it since Tuesday." He set the boy on the ground, crouched to his level, checked his face. His arms touched his son's shoulders with a specific, attentive tenderness that was less about injury assessment and more about something else, something that Victoria, watching, could not immediately name. Then he straightened and looked at her. "He can't read well yet. It takes him a long time to write things. He practiced the letters for 2 days." Victoria looked at the boy. Leo was still holding the box. He had adjusted his grip so that the crushed corner was against his chest, as if protecting it from further damage. She was aware of several things simultaneously: the cool morning air on her face, the sound of the city waking up below the bridge, the complete insufficiency of her Vance Holdings card. The way the man Elias, she would learn his name later, was watching her without accusation, simply watching, which was somehow harder to withstand than accusation would have been. "What is his name?" she said. "Leo." She walked to the boy. She did not know why she did this. She stood in front of him in her Chanel coat and her $300 shoes, and she bent down, which required a degree of physical awkwardness she did not enjoy until she was at his eye level. "Leo," she said, "I'm very sorry about your cake." The boy looked at her. His eyes were dark and direct, and entirely unimpressed by her coat or her shoes or anything else about her. "Did you see it before?" he asked. "No," she said. "I didn't." "It had a hammer on it," Leo said, "because my dad builds things. I did the hammer myself. It took a long time." "I believe you," Victoria said. "I'm sorry I ruined it." Leo considered this for a moment with the judicial seriousness of a child who understood that some apologies mattered and some didn't. "It's okay," he said finally, in the particular tone of someone who was being generous when they didn't have to be. "We can get a different one." Victoria straightened up and found Elias watching her. The blankness was gone from his expression. Something had shifted there, something small but legible, the way the first degree of warmth shifts the surface of still water. "Mister," she began. "Thorne," he said. "Elias Thorne." "Mr. Thorne." She put the card away. "Is there something I can do beyond insurance?" "The cake. I'd like to replace it." "You don't need to do that." "I'd like to." He looked at her for a long moment. Not the way men usually looked at her, measuring or calculating or slightly afraid. Straightforwardly. The way you looked at something you were trying to understand. "There's a bakery on Atlantic Avenue," he said. "Open at 7. "I'll have it delivered before 9, she said. She was already reaching for her phone when he said quietly, without any particular edge, "You could just come with us." Victoria looked up. Elias was already turning back toward the truck, lifting Leo in one smooth, practiced motion, settling him in the cab. He did not look back to see if she would follow. She stood on the Brooklyn Bridge for 3 seconds, her phone in her hand, the city coming alive beneath her, and then she put the phone in her pocket and walked toward the truck. She did not know in that moment that she was walking toward the most consequential decision of her life. She did not know about the woodshop or the demolition notice or the deal that would change everything. She did not know about the snowstorm coming or the fire or the truth buried in a subsidiary's legal archive that would eventually cost her everything she had spent 11 years building. All she knew, walking toward a rusty truck on the Brooklyn Bridge at 6 in the morning, was that she was following a man who had not taken her card, and that she could not, for the first time and as long as she could remember, identify exactly what to do next. They sat in the bakery on Atlantic Avenue, the three of them, while the morning light came through the plate glass windows and the city outside shifted from gray to gold. Leo sat across from Victoria and ate a chocolate croissant with the focused, serious pleasure of a child doing something excellent. Elias wrapped both hands around a coffee mug the size of a small bucket and watched her over the rim with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his default register, attentive without being intrusive, present without being demanding. She had answered 3 emails under the table. She was not proud of this. You're the Victoria Vance, Elias said. It was not a question. Yes. Leo, do you know who this is? Leo looked up from his croissant. A constellation of chocolate flakes was arranged on his lower lip. No. She's a very important businesswoman, Elias said. Leo evaluated this information and returned to his croissant, which had clearly won the comparison. Elias almost smiled. He's 7? He said to Victoria, as if this explained everything, and perhaps it did. What do you build? Victoria asked. It was the most direct question she had available, and directness had always been her instrument of choice. Furniture, bespoke, custom residential. He turned the mug between his hands. Some architectural installation work, whatever keeps the lights on. Your shop is in Brooklyn. Red Hook. He said it simply without the defensive pride that people sometimes attach to addresses. Been there 8 years. Victoria had already been calculating the way she calculated everything because calculation was her native language. She had flagged the Red Hook corridor 6 months ago during the planning stage of a mixed-use waterfront development. The demolition schedule was aggressive. The legal notices had gone out 90 days prior. She had not read the individual property reports. She had not needed to. That was what her team was for. Thorne & Son Woodworks, she said. That's right. She looked at him across the table with its sugar dispenser and its paper napkins, and she thought about the envelope sitting on her desk back in Manhattan, the one from the Vance Holdings Development Division, the one with a Red Hook property list inside it. And she thought about what it meant that this man's shop was on that list, and she thought about the boy with chocolate on his lip, who had spent 2 days learning to write the letters on a birthday cake. Mr. Thorne, she said, I think there's something you should know. He looked at her without alarm, simply waiting. Your property is scheduled for demolition, she said. 90 days from last Thursday. The stillness that moved across his face was not the stillness of shock. It was the stillness of a man who had been hit before and knew how to absorb impact without going down. It lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then he said, I know. She had not expected that. I received the notice, he said. I've been looking at my options. What are your options? He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't evasion but consideration. Relocate if I can find a space in the budget, or close. He glanced at Leo. Close is not an option. Victoria sat with this for a moment. She was aware that she was in new territory. Not professionally new, but personally new. The particular unfamiliar terrain of a situation where her professional authority and her personal responsibility occupied the exact same space and pointed in opposite directions. She made a decision. She made it the way she made all decisions quickly and completely, and then she put it into words before she could refine it into something more cautious. I'd like to make you a proposal, she said. Elias set down his coffee mug. I'm listening. I have a problem, she said. A public image problem. I need to demonstrate credibly and publicly that I am capable of functioning as part of a family unit, for a government contract that my company needs to survive. She paused. I am not historically good at this. Leo looked up at this last sentence with sudden, focused interest. What I need, Victoria continued, is a family, for appearances, weekend PR events, charity galas, possibly a photographed community engagement or two. In exchange for your participation, the demolition order on your property is reversed permanently, and Leo receives a fully funded education trust. She named a figure. The bakery was quiet for a moment. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past. The morning light moved across the table. Elias looked at her for a long time, not with greed, which she had expected, and not with outrage, which she had also anticipated, with something more careful than either. You're asking me to lie, he said. I'm asking you to perform, she said. There's a distinction. Not to me there isn't. She respected that. She did not say so, but she noted it. One condition, Elias said. Name it. When you step into my world, he said, my shop, my neighborhood, anywhere that is mine and Leo's, you are not the CEO of anything. You are a guest, and you treat my son with the respect you would want shown to someone you love. He paused. Can you do that? Victoria thought about the last time she had been genuinely uncertain whether she could do something. She could not remember the occasion. Yes, she said. Elias nodded once. Then I'll hear the full terms, he said. In writing. Leo had finished his croissant. He was now looking at Victoria with the wide, uncomplicated assessment of a child who had not yet learned to disguise his curiosity. Are you going to be our friend? He asked. Victoria looked at the boy. That depends, she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended, on whether I'm any good at it. Leo thought about this seriously. I'll teach you, he said. It's not that hard. Elias looked out the window. His expression was complicated and careful, and she could not read all of it, but she thought she saw at the edges something that might have been the first careful, reluctant movement of a door that had been shut for a very long time. Outside, the Brooklyn morning had turned fully gold. The city moved around the bakery window, indifferent and relentless, and entirely unaware that something small and irreversible had just shifted inside it. Victoria Vance picked up her coffee, which had also gone cold, and drank it anyway. It was the best coffee she had tasted in years. The contract was 12 pages long. Victoria had her legal team drafted over 2 days, and when Elias sat across from her at the small table in the back of his woodshop and read every single page without hurrying, she realized she had underestimated him again. He read the way he worked methodically, without performance, pausing at specific clauses and asking questions that were precise enough to make her lawyer present by phone clear his throat twice. Clause 7, Elias said without looking up. The appearance schedule. It says up to 14 weekends over the calendar year. I need that changed to no more than 14. That's a minor semantic distinction, her lawyer said through the phone speaker. Then it should be easy to change, Elias said pleasantly. It was changed. He signed on a Saturday morning in early October using a pen he pulled from his own shirt pocket, a carpenter's pencil worn down to a stub that left marks slightly too thick for the signature line. Victoria had watched him sign his name and thought, without knowing why, that it was one of the most deliberate signatures she had ever seen. Like he understood the full weight of what he was putting his name on. Leo was in the back of the shop during the signing, building something with scrap wood and a child-sized hammer that made a sound every 40 seconds like a small, enthusiastic clock. When his father called him out to witness the handshake, Leo wiped his hands on his jeans, walked over and shook Victoria's hand with the gravity of someone completing a transaction he fully intended to honor. Deal, Leo said. Deal, Victoria said. She had driven back to Manhattan with the signed contract in her briefcase and the sound of that small hammer still in her ears. The first weekend began on a Saturday in mid-October, and Victoria arrived in Red Hook at 9 in the morning in a charcoal theory blazer carrying a leather portfolio and a printed schedule she had organized into 30-minute blocks. The schedule had been Priya's finest hour, color-coded, time-stamped. Cross-referenced with the 3 PR events Victoria had booked for the following month, a charity gala in November, a community investment press event in December, and a photographed visit to a Brooklyn children's literacy program that her communications director had described as gold for the image campaign. The weekend family bonding sessions were listed under a tab labeled Asset Development Personal. Priya had used that label because she knew Victoria would be more comfortable with it. She had not been wrong. Elias was already at work when Victoria walked through the wide wooden doors of Thorn and Son Woodworks. He was at the central workbench, a slab of reclaimed oak the size of a dining table, using a hand plane on a long piece of walnut. He moved the plane in long, even strokes, leaning into each pass with his full body weight, and the curls of wood that fell from the blade were thin as paper and smelled extraordinary, a warm, dark fragrance that Victoria had no reference point for because she had never been in a room where things were being made by hand. She stopped just inside the doors. The shop was nothing like she had imagined, though she had not, she realized, imagined it very specifically. It was large with high ceilings crossed by old timber beams. The walls were hung with tools arranged in silhouettes, each peg and hook positioned with a precision that she recognized instinctively as the precision of someone who cared about their work. Sawdust was everywhere, drifting in the light from the high windows settled into the grain of the concrete floor. There was a radio on a high shelf playing something with a guitar in it. The whole space smelled of beeswax and raw wood and linseed oil, and it was warm in the specific way that rooms were warm when they had been occupied and worked in and lived in for a long time. It was the most foreign environment Victoria Vance had stood in since she was 23 years old and had walked into her father's hospital room for the first time. Elias looked up. He assessed her blazer and portfolio without comment. "Coffee's on the workbench," he said, and returned to his planing. There was a thermos and 2 ceramic mugs, both the size of the one from the bakery, both clearly made by hand, slightly irregular at the rim in the way that handmade things were. Victoria poured herself a cup and stood there with her portfolio under one arm and tried to identify what she was supposed to do next. This was an unfamiliar sensation. She opened the portfolio and set the printed schedule on the corner of the nearest workbench. "I thought we could go over the framework for the day, she said. Elias ran the plane down the walnut one more time, examined the result, and set the tool down. He picked up the schedule. He read it. His expression did not change exactly, but something moved through it the way weather moved through a clear sky, briefly and completely. 30-minute blocks, he said. It's efficient. For a board meeting, he said. He set the schedule back on the workbench. Leo gets up when he wakes up. He eats when he's hungry. On Saturdays, he works on his own projects back there. He nodded toward the back of the shop from which no hammer sound was currently coming, which meant Leo was still asleep upstairs in the apartment above the shop. You're welcome to sit to help to watch. There's no agenda. Victoria looked at the schedule. She looked at the shop. She looked at the thermos. How am I supposed to demonstrate family engagement for the PR photographs if there is no agenda? She said. By actually being here, Elias said. He picked up his plane and went back to work. The photographs will take care of themselves. She did not find this satisfying. She found it, in fact, deeply unsatisfying in the specific way that situations without clear metrics were always unsatisfying to her. But she had signed a contract that gave Elias Thorne authority over his own domain, and she had agreed to his terms, and Victoria Vance honored contracts. It was perhaps the most fundamental thing about her. Whatever else she was or was not, she honored what she signed. She moved the schedule to the side, sat down on a high stool at the far end of the workbench, opened her laptop, and began reading quarterly reports. The shop filled with the sound of the plane and the guitar on the radio, and 40 minutes later the sound of small feet on the wooden stairs. Leo arrived in the shop the way children arrived in spaces they felt completely safe in, without announcement or ceremony, wearing pajama pants with cartoon sharks on them, and a sweatshirt that said Brooklyn over a graphic of the bridge. He had a piece of toast in one hand and a small battered notebook in the other, and he stopped when he saw Victoria not with alarm, but with the recalibrating assessment of someone who had remembered something they had momentarily forgotten. You're here, he said. Good morning, Victoria said. Leo looked at her laptop. Are you working? Yes. My dad works on Saturdays too, Leo said, as if this established a meaningful equivalence between them, which perhaps it did. He took a bite of toast and went to the back of the shop where a child-height workbench had been built against the wall. Its surface covered in small projects at various stages of completion, a birdhouse with a crooked roof, a wooden car with one wheel slightly off axis. Something that might have been a boat or might have been a box. It was difficult to determine. Victoria watched him climb onto his stool, open the notebook, and study whatever was written or drawn inside it, with the concentrated seriousness of a professional reviewing blueprints. What is he building? She asked Elias quietly. He hasn't told me yet, Elias said without looking up from his walnut. He'll tell me when he's ready. That doesn't concern you, Tep. Why would it? Victoria did not have an immediate answer to this. She closed her quarterly report and watched Leo pick up a small piece of wood, turn it in his hand, set it down, pick up another. She realized simply watched a child work before. She was not certain she had simply watched anyone work before, not without an agenda attached to it. It was strange. It was also unexpectedly something close to peaceful. She opened the quarterly report again and told herself she was being sentimental. The first PR event was in November, a charity gala at a renovated warehouse in Dumbo, benefiting arts education in underprivileged schools. Victoria had selected it carefully. The guest list included 3 members of the Federal Review Committee for the Whitmore contract, a favorable journalist from a major lifestyle publication, and a photographer whose Instagram following was substantial and whose aesthetic was described by Priya as warmly documentary. She had briefed Elias in his shop the previous Saturday. He had sat on the stool she had come to think of as his stool at the head of the main workbench, and listened to the entire briefing with the attentiveness he brought to everything which was complete and uncomplicated and somehow still slightly unnerving. "Leo will need a suit," Victoria said. She had pulled up 3 options on her tablet. Elias looked at the tablet. "He's 7. The event is formal. He'll wear what he's comfortable in." Elias pushed the tablet gently back toward her. "He has good pants and a buttoned shirt. That's what he'll wear." Elias, the entire point of the evening is to project a certain image. "I know what the point of the evening is," he said, still without heat. "The point of the evening from where I'm standing is to show the people at that party that you can be part of a family. A real one, not a catalog." He looked at her steadily. "Leo in a miniature tuxedo is a catalog. Leo in his own clothes being himself is a family." Victoria opened her mouth and closed it again. He was right. She hated that he was right. She put the tablet away. The evening itself was by every measurable metric a success. Victoria arrived with Elias at her side and Leo between them. Leo in navy pants and a white button shirt that his father had ironed with visible care. His dark hair combed with the slightly over-neat precision of a child who had been told to look nice and had taken the instructions seriously. Victoria wore a deep blue dress uncharacteristically warm in its color because Priya had begged her not to wear gray for once, and Victoria had calculated that the concession was strategically sound. They moved through the room, and Victoria did what she always did at events, worked the space, read the groups, identified the targets. But she found unexpectedly that the most effective thing she did all evening was not strategic at all. It was kneeling down in the middle of the gallery to look at a child-height art installation with Leo, who had stopped dead in front of it, arrested by something in the layered paper sculpture that spoke to whatever was happening in that private, serious mind of his. Victoria had knelt beside him and looked at it too genuinely, because something in the way Leo looked at things made her want to see what he was seeing. The photographer had caught it. She had not arranged it. She had not even known the photographer was nearby. The image ran the following Tuesday. Victoria Vance, the woman the tabloids had called the ice architect for 2 years, kneeling on a gallery floor in a blue dress beside a small boy. Both of them looking at a piece of art with identical expressions of quiet, concentrated attention. Her communications director called at 7 in the morning. "I don't know what you did," he said, "but do it again." Victoria stood at her penthouse window with her cold coffee and thought about Leo's face in front of that sculpture, and thought about the specific inadequacy of the word effective as a description for what she had felt kneeling beside him. She put that thought somewhere it wouldn't interfere and went to her morning briefing. The weekends accumulated. October became November. November moved toward December, and the woodshop worked its strange, gradual alchemy on Victoria Vance in ways she was only partially aware of and would not have been able to articulate with the precision she preferred. She stopped bringing the printed schedule after the 3rd weekend. She did not announce this decision. She simply arrived one Saturday without it, and Elias did not comment, and somehow the absence of the schedule made the day both more uncomfortable and more real than any of the previous ones had been. She learned things in the woodshop that no one in her professional life had ever taught her. She learned that different woods had different personalities, that oak was stubborn, and walnut was cooperative, and cherry was unpredictable, in the way beautiful things sometimes were. She learned this not from instruction, but from watching Elias, from the way his hands changed their pressure and their angle, depending on what he was working with, from the way he talked to Leo about materials, as though they were characters in a story. She learned that Leo was teaching himself to read through the notebooks. He kept little hand-drawn dictionaries where he had drawn pictures of things and written the words beside them in letters. He had shaped himself imperfect and earnest and absolutely his own. She learned that he had been told by someone, a teacher whose name she never learned, but whom she came to quietly resent, that his difficulty with letters meant he was not smart. She learned this because Leo told her one afternoon when they were sitting together at his workbench, and she had asked him about the notebook, and he had said with the matter-of-fact candor of a child who had not yet learned to make his wounds into secrets, "Mrs. Peterson said reading takes a certain kind of brain, and maybe I have a different kind." Victoria had looked at the notebook, at the careful drawings, and the hand-shaped letters, and something moved in her chest with a sharpness she did not expect. "Mrs. Peterson," she said, her voice very even, "is incorrect." Leo looked at her. "Some of the most important builders in history had a different kind of brain," she said. "It meant they saw things other people couldn't see. It wasn't a disadvantage. It was a different instrument." She paused. "Do you understand what I mean by instrument?" "Like a tool," Leo said. "Exactly like a tool," Victoria said. Leo looked at his notebook for a moment. Then he picked up his pencil and added something to a page she couldn't see from her angle. She did not ask what it was. It was the most important conversation she had in the entire month of November. It was on the first Saturday of December during the fourth weekend of what the contract called family engagement sessions, that the cup of water was spilled. Victoria was at the secondary workbench, the one nearest the window that had become by unspoken agreement her workspace during shop hours. She had set up her laptop there and surrounded it gradually over the previous weeks with items that had migrated from her bag to the bench and had simply remained. A second coffee mug. A small notebook she had started keeping, though she could not have said exactly why. Her phone charger coiled beside the wall outlet like a faithful animal. She was in the middle of reviewing a confidential legal brief related to the Whitmore contract review when Leo ran through the shop. He was not supposed to run inside. He knew this, but he had been showing her something, a wooden toy he had been building for 2 weeks, and had finally completed that morning, a small articulated figure that could bend at the elbows and the knees, and he was demonstrating how it moved, holding it above his head and moving his feet in an approximate run that was more of an excited trot, and his elbow caught the edge of the cup. The water went directly across the open legal brief. The pages immediately bloomed with moisture, the ink in the margin notes, running the careful grid of highlighted clauses dissolving. Victoria stood up. The instinct was total and immediate, a full-body reflex from 11 years of boardroom authority, of zero tolerance for disorder, of the particular fury she reserved for situations where careful work was undone by carelessness. She stood both hands flat on the bench and drew breath. Leo had frozen. He was standing with the wooden figure raised above his head, both feet planted, his eyes wide and fixed on her face, with a look she recognized with a small cold shock of recognition as the look of a child who was waiting to be told he had done something unforgivable. She had seen that look before. She had put it on people's faces. She had not known until this moment what it cost to see it on the face of a 7-year-old. She was drawing the breath to speak when Elias was there. She did not see him move. He was at his workbench, and then he was between her and his son, his broad back to her, his body a physical fact in the space between her anger and his child. He did not raise his voice. He turned to face her over his shoulder, and his eyes were steady and completely clear, the eyes of a man who had drawn a line in the ground and stood on it without apology. "In that glass tower of yours," he said quietly, "you are the CEO. I know that. You have every right to be everything you are in that building." He paused. "But when you step through these wooden doors, you are a guest in my son's home." Another pause, not for effect, but because he was choosing every word with the care he chose his materials. "You will not raise your voice at him here. Not today. Not ever." The shop was completely silent. The radio had stopped between songs. The morning light lay flat and golden across the sawdust on the floor. Victoria looked at Elias's face. She looked at the brief, its pages ruined and curling at the edges. She looked at Leo, who was still holding the wooden figure above his head, watching her from behind the safety of his father's frame. The anger that had risen in her was not gone. It was still there, a hot current in her chest. But something else was there now too, something that moved through the anger and did not dissolve it, but changed its shape entirely. No one in 11 years had stood between her and anything. Not her board, not her lawyers, not her executive team, whose collective professional purpose was in large part to facilitate whatever direction her anger chose to point. Not a single person in the professional architecture of her life had ever placed themselves between Victoria Vance and a consequence she intended to deliver. This man had done it for a child and a spilled cup of water. She lowered her hands from the bench. "Leo," she said. Her voice came out different than it had gone in lower. The heat in it banked down to something more careful. "It was an accident. The brief can be reprinted." Leo lowered the wooden figure from above his head. He looked at it, then at her. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be upset," she said. "Show me how the arms work." Leo looked at his father. Elias stepped aside and the morning light fell back across the shop floor, and Leo walked to Victoria's bench and showed her in careful detail how the articulated joints of the small wooden figure moved. Elias went back to his workbench and picked up his tools, but she saw him in the periphery of her vision close his eyes for one brief moment before he began to work again, as if he was releasing something he had been holding tightly. She picked up the ruined brief with one hand and held it over the waste bin and let it fall. She did not reprint it that day. She sat on her stool and watched Leo demonstrate his wooden figure, and drank her coffee and said nothing about the Whitmore contract, or the board, or Roland, or any of the 46 things that were permanently, urgently, relentlessly demanding her attention. She sat in the shop and was for 40 minutes simply present. It was the hardest thing she had done all year. And it was, she thought, though she would not have said so aloud to anyone, the closest thing to rest she had felt in a very long time. December in New York had a specific quality that Victoria had always processed as logistical rather than atmospheric. The cold meant heavier coats, which required adjusting the timing of departures. The early dark meant scheduling evening calls before 5. The holiday season meant a calendar so compressed that her assistant color-coded the blocks in increasingly desperate shades of red. December was not a month Victoria experienced. It was a month she managed. This December was different, though she had not yet understood precisely how. The weekends in Red Hook had become something she could not categorize cleanly, and the inability to categorize something was for Victoria a specific kind of discomfort. She did not dislike the shop. That was the problem. She had expected to tolerate it the way you tolerated a necessary unpleasantness, a difficult client dinner, a red-eye flight, a conversation you needed to have but did not want to. She had not expected to find herself on Tuesday mornings thinking about the smell of beeswax. She had not expected to find herself during board calls that ran 90 minutes without resolution briefly and involuntarily imagining the specific quality of silence in the shop when Elias was deep in a complicated piece and Leo was at his bench and the radio played something low and the sawdust drifted in the window light. She had not expected any of it, and she did not know exactly what to do with what she had not expected. The charity gala photographs had done their work. The image of her and Leo in front of the paper sculpture had been picked up by 2 national publications and shared extensively online. Her communications director, a man named Griffin, who had survived 3 years in Victoria's orbit through a combination of genuine talent and strategic invisibility, had told her the sentiment analysis on her public profile had shifted 17 points in 6 weeks, which was, in his words, unprecedented. Roland had called once since then, a shorter conversation cooler in its calculation, which meant he was recalibrating. The Whitmore Contract Review Committee had requested a site visit in January. Everything was working. The plan was proceeding exactly as designed. So Victoria could not explain why she sat at her penthouse window on a Wednesday evening in the second week of December and felt looking out at the 68th floor view she had once loved and then stopped loving and then simply stopped noticing a hollow restlessness she had no professional language for. Her phone lit up. "Priya." "The weekend weather report," Priya said in the tone of someone delivering information they expected to be consequential. "The National Weather Service upgraded the winter storm warning this morning. They're projecting 18 to 24 inches of accumulation beginning Friday evening. Wind gusts up to 50 miles per hour. They're calling it the largest storm to hit the metro area in 11 years. "Reschedule anything affected," Victoria said automatically. "Already done," Priya said. "But I wanted to flag Mr. Thorne was planning to drop off the signed copies of the December appearance rider on Saturday morning. He called to ask if you wanted to reschedule." Victoria thought about the woodshop. She thought about Leo. She thought about how Elias had said when she had asked him last Saturday whether Leo's school reading program was showing results. "He read me a whole paragraph last Tuesday. He stumbled twice, but he didn't stop. When he finished, he looked up at me like he'd climbed a mountain. She thought about the way Elias's face had looked when he said that, open and unguarded in a way it almost never was with her, and how she had turned back to her laptop so he would not see whatever had happened to her own face in response. "Tell him Saturday is fine," she said. "The building has a full storm protocol. The parking structure is covered." She hung up and looked at the weather radar on her phone for a long moment and thought about the view from her 68th floor window during a blizzard, the way the city disappeared into white, the way the wind at that height made sounds against the glass that she had always privately found unsettling. She thought about the smart home system, the Lutron panels, and the climate control, and the automated everything that her interior designer had spent 4 months installing and that she had used approximately 15% of. She put her phone down and went back to the quarterly review she had been working on for 3 hours, and told herself she was not thinking about the storm. It came on a Friday night, the way the worst things came quietly at first and then all at once. Victoria was on a call with her Singapore office when the first advisory pushed to her phone. She was reviewing the amendments to the Whitmore proposal language when the second advisory arrived. She was eating dinner standing at her kitchen counter, a habit she had maintained for so long it no longer registered as something she was choosing to do when the snow began to hit the windows with a sound she could hear even through the triple-pane glass, a low, persistent hiss that was more insistent than the usual city sounds and less easy to ignore. By midnight, the city below her window had disappeared. Not dimmed, not obscured, gone. Where there had been streets and lights, and the constant kinetic evidence of 10 million people living their lives there, was now only white. A total and absolute white that moved and shifted and had no bottom, as if the world had simply been erased below the 68th floor. Victoria stood at the window for a long time. She did not sleep well. She was accustomed to not sleeping well, but this was different from the insomnia of high-pressure deadlines, which was at least purposeful in its misery, her mind working through problems with the driving forward momentum of an engine that had forgotten how to idle. This was something else. She lay in her perfectly temperature-regulated bedroom in her perfectly engineered silence and felt with a clarity that was neither comfortable nor welcome, profoundly alone. In the morning, the storm was still going. The smart home panel showed a temperature outside of 8 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind advisory had been upgraded. She made coffee with her Italian espresso machine, a machine that cost more than most people's first cars, and stood at the window and drank it and watched the white and thought about nothing she wanted to think about. The power went out at 11:47 in the morning. It did not go out dramatically. There was no surge, no pop, no cinematic flicker. One moment the apartment was its normal self, climate-controlled and precisely illuminated and full of the low hum of expensive machinery doing its work. And then there was simply nothing. The hum stopped. The lights went out. The heat, which she had never consciously noticed because it had always simply been there, stopped. The silence that followed was of a completely different quality than the engineered silence she was accustomed to. This was not the absence of disturbance. This was the presence of something, the actual world, actual cold, actual dark, pressing itself against the glass, and finding with the power off that the glass was thinner than anyone had indicated. Victoria called building maintenance. The line rang without answer. She called the emergency line. A recorded message told her the backup generator was handling critical systems only, and that full power restoration was estimated at 8 to 12 hours pending grid stabilization. She called Priya, who was stranded in her apartment in Queens and deeply apologetic. She called her driver, who was in New Jersey and going nowhere. Her phone was at 42% battery. She put on her coat, then her second coat, a heavier one she kept for rare occasions when she had to be outdoors in genuine cold. She sat on her couch in both coats and looked at the extraordinary art on her walls pieces she had acquired with the same methodical purpose she brought to all acquisitions, and registered that they were doing nothing at all for the temperature, which was dropping with a steady, indifferent patience that her entire net worth was currently unable to address. She sat like that for an hour, maybe longer, her breath beginning to show faint white in the air before her, and she thought about her father, which was something she had not permitted herself to do with any depth in a very long time. She thought about the last winter he was alive, when she had been 29, and the company had been hemorrhaging, and she had visited him 3 times in 6 weeks because she could not afford professionally to visit more often, and he had not complained, and she had told herself he understood, And she still, all this time later, was not entirely certain he had. And she was not entirely certain she had deserved his understanding if he had given it. The apartment was very cold and very dark and very quiet. The intercom crackled. She crossed the apartment in both coats and pressed the talk button. "It's Elias." Victoria stood with her finger on the intercom button and closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "The building has storm protocols," she said. Her voice was completely steady. She was proud of it and ashamed of her pride simultaneously. "The parking structure is covered," he said, and she could hear in his voice that he was using her own words back at her gently, without mockery. "I have snow chains on the truck." I was already on my way with the documents when the power advisory hit. "Leo is with a neighbor." A brief pause. "Buzz me up, Victoria." She buzzed him up. She was standing in the middle of her dark living room when he came through the door, stamping snow from his boots in the entry. Pulling off his jacket, a different jacket than usual, thicker, the kind with a canvas exterior and a visible lining. The kind of jacket that was selected for actual weather rather than appearance. He had a canvas duffel over one shoulder, and he was carrying, inexplicably, an axe. Victoria looked at the axe. "Why?" she said. "Do you have an axe?" "Because I'm a carpenter," he said, looking around the apartment with the same methodical, assessing attention he gave to materials, evaluating, cataloging, determining what was needed and what was available. "And you have a fireplace." Victoria turned and looked at the fireplace. It was on the east wall, flanked by 2 pieces of sculpture that her designer had selected to complement its proportions. It was white marble, pristine and precisely maintained. In 3 years of living in this apartment, she had never used it. She was not entirely certain it was functional. It was to her an architectural feature. "That fireplace is decorative," she said. "No such thing," Elias said, and he was already moving toward the chair. The chair was an Eames lounge chair in walnut and cream leather, a piece her designer had described as iconic, and her accountant had not spoken to her for a week after the purchase. It was beautiful and sculptural, and it cost more than some people's annual salaries. Elias looked at it with his carpenter's eyes for approximately 3 seconds, then looked at Victoria. "This is wood," he said. "That is an Eames," she said. "It's also cold in here," he said, "and it is going to get colder." He met her eyes. The look on his face was not casual. He was asking her something real. "Do you want to be warm?" Victoria looked at the chair. She thought about what it had cost. She thought about the temperature in the room and the temperature outside and the 8 to 12 hours of estimated restoration time. She thought about sitting in both coats on her couch in the dark while the cold pressed itself through 68 floors of glass and steel with a patience that was in the end absolute. "Do what you need to do," she said. What happened next was something she watched with her full attention because it demanded her full attention in a way that very little did anymore. Elias worked with no wasted motion. He disassembled the chair with his hands and a tool from the duffel, and the sounds it made, the wood separating from the leather, the frame coming apart at its joints, were clean and precise, the sounds of someone who understood how things were put together, and therefore understood exactly how to take them apart. He checked the flue, which was functional, which she had not known. He built the fire in the fireplace with a competence that was entirely without theater kindling first. Then the walnut frame of the chair, arranged with a specific architecture of its own, that she recognized watching it as the same consideration he brought to every structure he made. The fire caught. The light it produced was different from every light in the apartment. All the light she lived with was engineered, selected, positioned. This light moved. It had behavior. It reached into the dark corners of the room and pulled them into amber and made the ceiling seem lower, and the room seem smaller, but smaller in a way that was the opposite of confining, smaller in the way that a room was smaller when it was genuinely inhabited. Elias set up a portable camp stove, small, efficient, the kind of thing that had clearly been in the duffel for exactly this category of situation. He put water on to boil and did not speak, and Victoria sat on the floor in front of the fire in both coats because the floor was the closest point to the warmth, and because there was no one here to observe the CEO of Vance Holdings sitting cross-legged on her own floor in a double coat watching a fire built from her own furniture. He handed her a cup of tea. She had not asked for tea. She did not generally drink tea. She took it with both hands and held it, and felt the warmth move from the ceramic through her palms and up her arms, and thought with absolute clarity that it was the most useful thing anyone had given her in years. "You drove from Brooklyn in a blizzard," she said. "Yes," he said. He sat on the floor across from her, not beside her, but across so the fire was between them, and pulled the duffel toward him and took out a small block of wood and a carving knife. She watched his hands find the knife the way they found all his tools, without looking by touch alone. "Why?" she said. He turned the block in his hands, examining it, looking for something in the grain that she could not see. "Because the documents needed signing," he said. "Elias." He looked up. "Why did you drive from Brooklyn in a blizzard?" she said again, and her voice was different this time. Stripped of the professional finish she put on everything, the question underneath the question, audible now in the firelit room where her phone was dead and the corporate world had temporarily ceased to exist. He held her gaze for a moment. The fire moved between them. "Because I knew you'd be up here alone," he said simply, "and I knew you'd never call anyone to say so." Victoria looked at the fire. The walnut frame of the Eames chair was burning with a clean, steady heat that was extraordinary, and she thought about the fact that a chair worth more than some cars was warming her hands right now, and that it had been the right decision, fully and completely the right decision, and she could not have arrived at that decision alone. She did not respond to what he had said. There was nothing to say to it that would not be inadequate. But she pulled the blanket he had taken from the duffel and placed beside her without comment around her shoulders, and she stayed where she was on the floor in front of the fire. He carved. She watched. The knife moved through the wood in slow, certain passes, and the shape that emerged from the block was not yet identifiable, but had the quality of intentionality, the quality of something that knew what it was going to be even before it was fully visible. Curls of pale wood fell to the floor around his crossed legs, and the fire snapped and shifted, and outside the windows the storm moved through the city with its enormous impersonal authority. And inside this room that had always been silent in the wrong way, the silence was different. She did not know when she fell asleep. She did not know it was happening, which was itself the most remarkable part, because Victoria Vance did not simply fall asleep. Sleep was something she negotiated. Something she approached with melatonin and sleep masks and white noise applications, and the full apparatus of someone who had forgotten how to surrender to unconsciousness without engineering it first. She had not fallen asleep naturally without aid or preparation in longer than she could accurately remember. But the fire was warm and the sound of the knife on the wood was steady and unhurried, and she had been carrying a very large weight for a very long time. And sometime in the late afternoon of that December Saturday, with the storm outside and the firelight inside, and the sound of Elias Thorne carving something into shape in the corner of her vision, Victoria Vance let go of the weight, just for a moment, just for now. She slept. When she woke, the fire was lower and the room was full of a deep, dark blue that meant evening had come. She was lying on her side on the floor with the blanket over her and a folded jacket under her head that had not been there when she fell asleep. The storm outside had quieted to something persistent, but no longer violent. The camp stove had been relit, and there was the smell of soup, actual soup from somewhere. Elias was at the fireplace adding a piece of wood, and he did not look up immediately when she stirred, giving her a moment to orient herself, which she understood was intentional. On the floor beside where she had been sleeping was the carved block. It was a bird, small and precise. Its wings folded, its head turned slightly to one side, the kind of looking sideways posture birds had when they were paying close attention to something. She picked it up. The wood was warm from the fire and smooth where the knife had worked it. "For Leo," Elias said without turning from the fireplace. "He's been asking me to teach him birds." Victoria held the small carved bird in both hands and looked at it for a long time. "Elias," she said. I haven't felt safe," she said slowly, choosing the words with more care than she chose most things in a very long time. The fireplace crackled. He turned and looked at her across the amber-lit room, and his face in the firelight was open in a way she had seen only once before, the morning at the bakery when Leo had offered to teach her how to be a friend. But this was different. This was older and quieter, and it cost him something. "I know," he said. Outside, the storm moved through the city. Inside, the fire held its small, warm ground against the dark, the way fires had always done, the way certain people did quietly and without fanfare, simply by being present, simply by refusing to let the cold win. Victoria did not let herself say anything more than that. But she held the carved bird, and she did not put it down, and the distance between them across the firelit floor felt for the first time since October less like the boundary of a contract and more like the beginning of something she did not yet have a word for and was not certain she deserved. She stayed where she was and watched the fire, and did not reach for her phone, which was dead anyway, and the night came down over the city, and the storm began slowly at last to exhaust itself. The carved bird was on Victoria's desk in the penthouse for 3 weeks before she moved it. She had not planned to keep it there. She had set it down on the corner of the desk the morning after the storm, when the power had come back and Elias had packed his duffel and driven back to Brooklyn in the gray post-blizzard light. And she had meant to put it somewhere else, a shelf, a drawer somewhere that was not directly in her sightline during the 12 to 14 hours a day she spent working at that desk. But the days moved fast in January, and the bird stayed where it was, and she stopped noticing. She was noticing it only gradually, the way you stop noticing any presence that had become, without formal announcement, a fixture. January had its own relentlessness. The Whitmore Contract Review Committee conducted their site visit on the 14th, a Thursday, and Victoria had been on her best performance, precise and warm in the way she had been practicing asking questions that demonstrated community investment without seeming calculated, which required a calibration of effort. She was only beginning to understand was not actually performance anymore, or was less performance than it had been in October. The committee chair, a careful woman named Dr. Elaine Marsh, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the particular patience of someone who had seen too many corporate charm offensives to be easily moved, had asked Victoria one question that landed differently than the others. "What changed for you?" Dr. Marsh had asked. They were standing in the conference room with its view of the Manhattan skyline, and the question was positioned as casual, a follow-up to a point Victoria had made about community-centered development philosophy, but its weight was real, and Dr. Marsh's eyes were steady and attentive behind the glasses. Victoria had paused. In the pause, she thought with a specificity she did not expect about Leo's notebook, about the careful drawings and the hand-shaped letters, and the sentence Mrs. Peterson said reading takes a certain kind of brain, and maybe I have a different kind. She thought about a carved bird sitting on her desk. She thought about waking up on a floor in front of a fire with a folded jacket under her head that had not been there when she fell asleep. "A 7-year-old told me he would teach me how to be a friend," she said, "because it wasn't that hard." She paused. "I'm still learning." Doctor. Marsh had looked at her for a long moment and then written something in her notebook, and Victoria, who could read upside-down text in a negotiation without effort, had not tried to read it because she had found unexpectedly that she did not want to know the score. She just wanted the answer to have been true. It had been true. That was the most surprising thing about January. February arrived with the specific gray determination of a month that knew nobody was glad to see it, and the weekends in Red Hook continued their accumulation. The shop had become over 4 months a place Victoria knew, in the way she knew very few places, not through analysis or acquisition, but through repeated, unhurried presence. She knew which floorboard near the secondary workbench had a soft spot that announced itself with a particular half-tone creak. She knew that Elias kept his most used chisels on the left side of the wall rack and his specialty planes on the right, and that the arrangement had a logic that was entirely his own, and that he had never explained, and she had never asked about, because some systems did not require explanation, they required only observation. She knew that Leo drank his Saturday morning orange juice in exactly 3 long pulls, and then set the glass down with a finality that meant he was ready to begin whatever the day had for him. She knew these things the way you knew the details of somewhere you lived. She had not examined this fact directly. She kept it in the same place she kept the other things she was not yet ready to examine directly, the way the carved bird sat on her desk without formal acknowledgement of what it meant that it was there. Roland called on the second Tuesday of February. She was in the car in the back seat coming from a site review in Long Island City. He called from his private cell, not his office line, which meant the call was not intended to be on record. Victoria noted this and answered anyway. "I hear the committee visit went well," Roland said. "It did. Your communications director has been busy." A pause that carried its full freight. "The family angle is working beautifully. The photographs are very convincing." "They're not photographs of a performance," she said. Her voice was even. "Of course not," Roland said in a tone that meant, "Of course they are." "I've been doing some thinking, Victoria, about the structure of the arrangement, about the Thorne situation." She felt something shift in the quality of her attention the way it shifted during negotiations when the other party moved toward the part of the conversation they had been building toward all along. "What about it?" she said. "I have some information that might be relevant to how you want to proceed," Roland said. "Why don't we have dinner? This week. Thursday." "Send me whatever you have in writing," she said. A brief silence. "Some things are better discussed in person." "Send it in writing," she said again. "Or don't send it at all." She hung up and looked out the window at the gray February cityscape moving past and felt the particular cold that had nothing to do with the weather settling somewhere in the center of her chest. She called Griffin. "I need you to look into something," she said. Quietly, not through legal, not through compliance, you personally. She paused. "Pull everything we have on the subsidiary liability files from 5 years ago. Construction, Brooklyn. Specifically anything related to a scaffolding incident." Griffin was quiet for a moment. "That's a specific request," he said carefully. "Yes," she said. "How far back in 5 years? Start with the Brooklyn waterfront development projects." Another pause. "Victoria, those files are archived under the restructuring settlement. They're sealed under the terms of the original agreement." "I know," she said. "Find me a way to look at them anyway." She hung up and looked at her own hands in her lap, and thought about Roland's voice, smooth and purposeful, and thought about the specific phrasing he had used. The Thorne situation. Not the arrangement, not the contract. The Thorne situation. As if Elias were a variable in an equation that Roland had been quietly solving for some time. She looked out the window and said nothing to no one, and the city moved past in its gray February skin, and she did not let herself complete the thought that was forming at the edge of her mind, because she was not ready to know what she already suspected. Griffin called back on Thursday morning. He did not call from his office phone. He called from his personal cell, which he had never done in 3 years of working for her, and when she heard that fact register in the silence before he spoke, she understood that what he had found was serious. "I need you to look at something," he said. "I need you to come look at it in person. Not email, not shared drive. In person." She went to his apartment in Hoboken that evening, which was in itself an indication of the gravity of the situation because Griffin lived in Hoboken specifically because it was not Manhattan and therefore not somewhere he expected his professional life to follow him. He met her at the door in a sweater, and the expression of a man who had spent 24 hours wishing he hadn't found what he had found. The files were on his kitchen table. Printed, not digital. He had printed them, and he had organized them in the way people organize things when they were frightened of what the organization revealed carefully, with the cover pages face down, as if turning them face up were an action that could be deferred. He turned them face up. Victoria read for 40 minutes without speaking. Griffin made coffee she did not drink and stood at the kitchen window looking at the Hudson and did not interrupt her. The file was titled in the bloodless language of corporate legal documentation, Settlement and Liability Closure Structural Incident Brooklyn Waterfront Phase 2 November, 5 years prior. She read the incident report first. A scaffolding collapse on a residential tower project a Tuesday morning in November. 3 workers injured, 1 fatally. The fatal victim was a subcontract site manager named Claire Thorne, 31 years old. Victoria set the page down. She picked it up again. She read the name again. Claire Thorne. She read the next document. The engineering assessment, which had been conducted by a firm retained by the Vance Holdings subsidiary that managed the project, a firm whose compensation structure detailed in an attached invoice that someone had either forgotten to remove or had included with the specific intent of making the conflict of interest visible to anyone who read. Carefully enough was contingent on findings that limited primary contractor liability. The assessment had concluded that the scaffolding failure was attributable to subcontractor error. The next document was a memo from the subsidiary's legal team to the managing director of the subsidiary at the time of the incident, detailing the settlement strategy. It recommended a rapid minimal settlement with non-disclosure provisions to prevent extended litigation, capitalizing on the surviving families. Her exact language was emotionally compromised state and limited legal resources. The managing director who had approved the strategy was Roland Vance. Victoria turned the page. The next document was the settlement agreement itself. Elias Thorne, listed as surviving spouse, had accepted a sum that was, by the calculations of anyone who had ever assessed a wrongful death case, a fraction of what competent legal representation would have recovered. The non-disclosure agreement was attached. Leo Thorne, listed as minor dependent, age 2. Leo had been 2 years old. She set the file down on Griffin's kitchen table and stood up and walked to the window and stood there for a long time with her back to the table and her hands at her sides and the lights of Manhattan across the river, doing nothing at all for the cold that was moving through her in long, slow waves. Griffin waited. "How contained is this?" she said. Her voice came out of a place below emotion factual and stripped the voice she used when the situation was too serious for anything else. "It's archived," Griffin said. "The settlement terms sealed the incident report, but the sealing was procedural, not court-ordered, which means it holds until someone with standing and motivation challenges it," she said. "Yes." She turned from the window. "Who else has seen this?" "In the company, the original legal team, most of whom have turned over in 5 years. Roland? Possibly 2 board members who were in position at the time." He paused. "And whoever Roland has had looking at it recently." "He has someone looking at it recently." The archive access log shows a pull request from an external IP address registered to a firm that does investigative work for high-net-worth clients, Griffin said. 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago. Around the time Roland had called with his carefully phrased dinner invitation and his information that might be relevant. Victoria looked at the file on the kitchen table. She looked at the name Claire Thorne on the incident report, and she thought about a 7-year-old boy in pajama pants with cartoon sharks on them, carrying a notebook full of careful drawings. She thought about a man who had read 12 pages of contract language without hurrying and asked precise questions and signed his name as if he understood the full weight of what he was committing to. She thought about a folded jacket under her head that had appeared while she slept and a carved bird that was still on her desk at home. She thought about Elias saying the very first morning on the Brooklyn Bridge with the hazard lights blinking orange in the pre-dawn gray, "Are you hurt?" And the question had been for her, not for himself, not for the truck, for her. She thought about everything Elias Thorne had carried for 5 years without knowing that the company with the same name as the woman standing in this kitchen was the reason he was carrying it alone. "Does Roland have copies?" she said. "Almost certainly," Griffin said. "What is he planning to do with them?" Griffin was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood that the next sentence was going to change several things permanently. "The way I read it," he said, "he plans to use them as leverage against you. Either you step down and hand him the company voluntarily, or he releases the file to the press framed to make Thorne look like a corporate plant, an extortionist who manufactured the arrangement to position himself for a lawsuit against the company. And then he uses the Vance legal team to open a custody challenge against Thorne, citing the non-disclosure violation and the media exposure as evidence of an unstable home environment for the child." The kitchen was very quiet. "Leo," Victoria said. "Yes." She stood in Griffin's kitchen in Hoboken on a Thursday evening in February and felt something happen in her chest that she did not have clinical language for. It was not simply anger, though. Anger was present, clean and total, and colder than anything Roland had ever made her feel in all the years of his careful, patient resentment. It was something older than the anger, and more dangerous, the specific feeling of a person who has been protecting something without knowing they were protecting it, and has just understood all at once what it is and what it costs to keep it safe. "I need to tell him," she said. Griffin looked at her. "Victoria, if you tell Thorne the non-disclosure agreement." The non-disclosure agreement, she said, was signed under duress by a man who had just lost his wife and was raising a 2-year-old alone with limited legal resources, as the memo so elegantly described it. It is almost certainly voidable, and I will not hide behind it for one more day. Griffin was quiet. I need to tell him, she said again, before Roland does. He deserves to hear it from me. She picked up the file. She held it in both hands for a moment, feeling its weight, which was not the weight of paper, but the weight of 5 years of a man's life, and a child growing up without a mother, and a truth that had been buried in an archive under Roland Vance's careful, self-preserving hand. Make me a copy, she said. Keep the original somewhere Roland can't reach it. Griffin took the file and went to his printer, and she stood in the kitchen and looked at Manhattan across the river and thought about what she was going to say and understood that there were no words adequate to it and that she had to say them anyway. She drove to Brooklyn on a Saturday morning in the last week of February. She did not call ahead. She had thought about calling ahead and decided against it, not because she was afraid of what he would say when he knew she was coming, but because she needed the drive. Needed the 25 minutes of moving through the city with the file on the passenger seat and the morning light flat and cold over the bridges, needed the time to be inside the decision she had made without the ability to unmake it. The shop was open. She could see the light through the high windows from half a block away. She pushed the wooden doors open and the warmth and the smell of sawdust reached her immediately. Beeswax and linseed oil and the particular woody warmth of a space that was always in use, and for a moment she stood in the doorway with the file under her arm and the cold at her back, and she let herself have one last moment of the shop as it had been for 4 months before what she was carrying changed it. Elias was at the main workbench. He was working a piece of maple with a spokeshalve, and he looked up when she came in with the expression she knew well by now, attentive and unhurried, the expression that meant he was genuinely present for whatever came next. Leo was at his small bench in the back. He saw her and raised a hand in the specific wave he had developed for her, 2 fingers, not a full wave. A greeting that was casual in the way that greetings were casual between people who saw each other regularly and whose relationship did not require ceremony. Victoria raised 2 fingers back. Then she looked at Elias. He read something in her face because he was a man who paid attention, and she was not at this moment wearing the professional finish she put on everything. He set the spokeshalve down. He looked at the file under her arm. Leo, he said, without taking his eyes from Victoria, can you go upstairs and check on the pasta? I put it on the stove 10 minutes ago. Leo hopped off his stool with the fluid ease of a child who trusted his father's requests without needing reasons for them. His feet on the stairs were light and quick. The door above clicked shut. The shop was quiet. The radio was playing something low. Sawdust moved in the window light. Victoria walked to the main workbench and set the file down in front of him. She placed her hand flat on the cover for a moment, and then she moved her hand away. There is something in this file, she said, that you have a right to know. I found it 10 days ago. I have been trying to find the right words for 10 days, and I have not found them, so I am just going to tell you. She looked at him directly, the way she looked at things she was not going to flinch from. The scaffolding collapse 5 years ago. The project on the Brooklyn waterfront. The contractor was a Vance Holdings subsidiary. The company knew the scaffolding failed because of negligence on their end. They covered it up. They hired an assessment firm to assign fault elsewhere, and then they sent their lawyers to settle with you quickly while you were grieving because they calculated that you were, in their words, emotionally compromised and without sufficient legal resources to fight them. Elias had gone very still. The kind of still that was not calm, but was the thing you became when you were absorbing something that was trying to knock you down and you would not let it. The managing director who approved that strategy, she said, was my Uncle Roland. The radio played something low, and the sawdust drifted in the window light, and outside on the Brooklyn street a car passed, and its sound moved through the shop and faded. I could have kept this from you, Victoria said, and her voice was shaking now, not with weakness, but with the specific tremor of a person saying something that is costing them the thing they most want to keep. I could have buried it again. Roland is using it as leverage against me. And if I tell you I lose the company and I lose everything I've spent 11 years building, and I knew all of that when I made the decision to come here." She stopped. "But you deserve to know who killed your wife, even if they share my last name." Elias stood on the other side of the workbench and looked at the file and did not open it. He stood with both hands flat on the bench, which was his own workbench in his own shop, surrounded by the tools of everything he had built in the aftermath of a loss that had been. She now understood not simply a tragedy, but a crime committed against him by people who had calculated that he could not fight back. When he looked up, his eyes were dark and completely dry, and the expression on his face was something she had never seen there before. Not the steadiness she knew, and not the warmth she had begun slowly and carefully to trust, but something beneath both of those, something older and quieter and more final. "Get out," he said. The words were not loud. They were not angry in the way that volume was anger. They were the words of a man who had been hit in a place that did not produce noise, only the particular silence of damage that went too deep for sound. "Elias, take Leo out of this," he said, and his voice broke on his son's name, a single clean fracture in the levelness he was holding with everything he had. "Do not come near my son again." Victoria picked up her bag. She left the file on the workbench. She walked to the wooden doors of the shop and pushed them open and stepped out into the cold February morning on the Red Hook Street where she had parked her car and where the city was doing what it always did moving forward, without sentiment, indifferent to what had just ended in the warm, sawdust-smelling room behind her. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold and did not cry, not because she did not feel the thing that produced crying, but because she was alone on a street in Brooklyn, and the feeling was too large and too final for the ordinary release of tears. It was the feeling of a door closing, not slamming, simply and permanently closing the way doors closed when the person on the other side had made a decision from a place too deep to be argued with or reasoned around or purchased out of. She had known it was possible. She had understood when she made the decision to drive to Brooklyn with the file under her arm that this was one of the outcomes available to her. She had not understood until this moment, standing in the February cold outside the wooden doors of Thorne & Son Woodworks, what it would feel like to lose the only place in 4 months where she had been genuinely warm. She got in her car. She sat there for a moment with both hands on the wheel and the engine off and the cold settling around her. Then she started the car and she drove, and she did not look in the rearview mirror at the shop, because she had made a choice, and choices of this kind did not benefit from looking back. She had told him the truth. She had lost him for it. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and she held them both as she drove across the bridge back toward Manhattan, back toward the glass tower and the board, and Roland, and everything that was waiting for her on the other side of what she had just done. The carved bird was still on her desk. She did not know yet what she was going to do about Roland. She did not know about the board meeting or the FBI or the compensation fund or any of the things that were coming. She knew only that she had driven to Brooklyn with the truth and laid it on a workbench and walked away from the consequences, and that it was the most honest thing she had done in 11 years. Outside, the city moved past her windows, gray and relentless, and entirely unchanged by any of it. She drove on. The week after Brooklyn was the longest week of Victoria Vance's professional life, and she had lived through weeks that included hostile takeovers, a shareholder revolt, and the morning her father's doctor had called her office instead of her personal line because she had listed the office as the primary contact. She did not sleep. This was not unusual, but the previous insomnia had always carried the productive hum of a mind working through problems with somewhere to go. This was different. This was the sleeplessness of a mind that had arrived at its destination and found the destination empty. She sat at her desk in the penthouse and worked. She worked the way she had always worked, which was completely and without visible remainder. 16 hours at a stretch, the city below her going through its cycles of dark and light, while she remained constant at her desk, and the carved bird sat in the corner of her vision, and she did not move it, and did not look at it directly, and did not stop seeing it. She had 3 problems. The first was Roland. The second was the board. The third was the truth of what Vance Holdings had done 5 years ago, which was not properly speaking a problem in the corporate sense of the word. It was a debt. It was a debt that had been accumulating interest for 5 years, in the form of a man raising a child alone in a woodshop in Brooklyn. And the only currency that would settle it was the one thing Victoria had spent 11 years treating as a last resort: full accountability. She called Griffin on a Sunday night. "I need everything," she said. "Every document, every memo, every invoice, every settlement agreement related to the Brooklyn waterfront incident. I need it authenticated, organized, and ready to present." "Present to whom?" Griffin said. "The board," she said. And then the FBI. The silence on the other end of the line was the silence of a man absorbing the full scope of what he had just heard. "Victoria," he said carefully, "if you take this to the FBI, the company—" "I know," she said. "The stock will." "I know. Roland will." "Griffin," she said. "I know. All of it. Prepare the files." He prepared the files. Roland called on Monday. She did not answer. He called on Tuesday through his lawyer, which meant he had decided the dinner conversation approach was no longer viable and had moved to the next instrument in his toolkit. The lawyer left a message that was phrased as a courtesy notification but was structured as a deadline. Victoria had 72 hours to arrange a meeting, or Roland would move forward with his plan to release the information. She listened to the message once and deleted it. On Wednesday, she called an emergency board session for Friday morning. The board members arrived with the particular wariness of people who have been called to an emergency meeting by a CEO, who has not explained the subject matter, which was everyone's least favorite kind of meeting to receive, and Victoria's most effective kind to convene. She had learned early in her tenure that the less you told people before a meeting, the more of their psychological energy they spent anticipating it, and people who arrived depleted by anticipation were easier to move. Roland was there. Of course he was there. He sat at the far end of the table in a suit that cost as much as her Eames chair had, and he looked at her with the composed, watchful expression of a man who believed he held all the relevant cards and was waiting for the moment to show them. The 7 other board members arranged themselves in the studied neutral positions of people who had been watching a power struggle from the sidelines for 3 months and had not yet committed to a side. Victoria stood at the head of the table. She did not sit. She had never delivered anything important sitting down. She looked at the faces around the table, faces she had been reading and managing and outmaneuvering for 11 years, and she felt with a clarity that was almost physical the specific weight of what she was about to put down. "I have called this meeting," she said, "to present the board with information that is material to the governance and legal standing of Vance Holdings. I am presenting this information in this room before I present it externally, not as a courtesy, but because you are entitled to understand the full scope of what this company did before you read it in the press." She nodded to Griffin, who was standing against the wall with a banker's box and the expression of a man doing something that frightened him because it was right. He distributed the files. The sound of 12 folders opening simultaneously was the sound of the end of something. 5 years ago, Victoria said, a scaffolding collapse on a Vance Holdings subsidiary project on the Brooklyn waterfront killed a 31-year-old woman named Claire Thorne. The company had knowledge that the collapse was caused by negligence attributable to the primary contractor, which was our subsidiary. That knowledge was suppressed. An assessment was commissioned from a conflicted firm to redirect liability. And then the surviving family, a widower and a 2-year-old child, was settled out quickly under a non-disclosure agreement, while the responsible parties within this company faced no consequences of any kind. The room was silent in the way that rooms were silent when the people inside them were doing rapid private calculations about what they had just heard. Roland's expression had not changed. He was watching her with the careful attention of a man who had not yet determined which direction the situation was moving. "The managing director who authorized the cover-up strategy," Victoria said, "was Roland Vance." She looked at her uncle. He looked back at her. And something moved through his expression, then something she had not expected. Not the cold calculation she was accustomed to, but something older, something that might have been in another man, a species of shame. It lasted 1 second, and then it was gone, replaced by the smooth, composed surface he had been maintaining for 30 years. "This is a significant misrepresentation of a legally settled matter," Roland said. His voice was perfectly controlled. "The settlement closed all liability. These documents are." These documents are authenticated, Victoria said, by an independent legal firm I retained on Thursday. The settlement, as I have been advised, is voidable on the grounds of procedural duress and the conflict of interest embedded in the original assessment. She paused. This is not a negotiation, Roland. I am telling the board what happened. The board can decide what to do with that information. Roland looked at her across the length of the table, and for the first time in her memory, he looked not beaten exactly, but located, placed, as if the room had finally identified where he stood in it. You are destroying this company, he said. And there was something in his voice that was not strategy, something that was genuinely personal. The voice of a man who had wanted something for a very long time and was watching it dissolve in front of him. I am not destroying it, Victoria said. I am telling the truth about it. Those are different things. She reached into the folder in front of her and produced one additional document, a single page, and placed it on the table. This is my resignation as CEO of Vance Holdings, effective immediately, she said. I am also announcing effective this morning the establishment of the Vance Accountability and Restitution Fund, capitalized from my personal holdings to provide full and fair compensation to the families affected by this company's past negligence, starting with the Thorne family. The room was very still. She looked around the table one last time at the faces of the people who had been her board for 11 years, some of whom she had fought, and some of whom she had earned, and some of whom she was only now in this moment meeting clearly for the first time. The FBI has received a copy of these documents this morning, she said. I recommend the board retain independent legal counsel immediately. She picked up her folder and her bag. She walked out of the boardroom of Vance Holdings for the last time on a Friday morning in February, and the sound of the door closing behind her was the quietest sound she had ever heard. The months that followed were not quiet. Quiet was not something that happened when a major corporation admitted institutional negligence and its CEO resigned in a single morning. What happened was loud and prolonged and covered extensively by people who had called her the ICE architect for 2 years, and now called her various other things, some of them grudgingly respectful and some of them not. Roland stepped down from the board under pressure from the independent directors 2 weeks after the meeting. The FBI investigation moved at the pace of federal investigations, which was not fast, but moved. The Whitmore contract review was suspended pending the outcome which was expected, and which Victoria had accepted with a straightforwardness that surprised even Griffin, who had expected her to fight for it. You built the whole year around that contract, he said on a Thursday afternoon in March, when they were closing out the last of the transition paperwork in her old office. I know, she said, and you don't. I don't, she said. She was putting the carved bird in her bag as she said it. She did this without thinking about it, the way you gathered things that belonged with you when you were leaving a place. The contract was the reason I knocked on his door. It was not the reason I kept going back. Griffin looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had spent 3 years working adjacent to her emotional life and had just seen something he had not previously been able to confirm existed. He did not say anything. He was smart enough to understand that some moments did not require comment. She moved out of the penthouse in April. She did not replace it with another penthouse. She found a 2-bedroom apartment in a brownstone building in the West Village with plaster walls and windows that let in actual morning light, and a kitchen where the appliances were not smart and were not Italian, and made coffee that was, she found to her surprise, perfectly adequate. The compensation fund was established formally in March. The legal process avoiding the original settlement and establishing fair restitution for the Thorne family was handled by a firm she selected specifically for their work in wrongful death cases and their reputation for treating clients as people rather than case numbers. She did not handle it herself. That would have been the wrong kind of involvement. She made the fund available and she made the legal resources available, and she stepped back because the one thing she understood now that she had not understood in October when this began was that some things could not be managed. They could only be honored. She did not contact Elias, not in February, not in March, not in April. She understood with the clarity that came from having finally learned to sit with uncomfortable things rather than act on them immediately. That contact was not hers to initiate. She had laid the truth on his workbench and walked out into the cold, and what he did with the truth was his. She started the architecture firm in March, a small nonprofit she incorporated under a name that was not Vance, anything. A clean name, a new name. With 3 colleagues she had met through the community development work adjacent to the Whitmore process. Young architects who were talented and underfunded and working on projects that mattered more than they paid. She worked from a narrow office in a building in the Flatiron district with exposed brick and a freight elevator that required manual operation and a coffee maker that was clearly from a previous decade and made she maintained better coffee than the Italian machine had ever produced. She took the subway. This was perhaps the most commented upon change in the coverage that followed her resignation. The photographs that ran in the spring of Victoria Vance on the subway platform in a wool sweater and flat shoes and a canvas bag reading something on her phone with the unremarkable posture of a person on her way to work. She had not engineered those photographs. She had not thought about them. She had simply been on the subway because the subway went where she was going and she no longer had a driver, and she had found to her own surprise that she did not miss the car. She missed Brooklyn. She missed it with a specificity that she recognized after some months of sitting with it as the specific shape of loss that was also love, the way you missed a place that had changed you in ways you were still in the process of understanding. She did not let herself do anything about that feeling. She had earned the practice of sitting with difficult feelings without immediately converting them into action, and she practiced it. Spring came to the city in early May. The way it always did, tentative and then sudden, the way the best things came. The trees on the West Village block where she now lived went from bare to full in what felt like a single morning, and she noticed this because she was someone who walked to work now and who therefore moved through the city at a pace that permitted noticing. She was working on the playground. It had begun as a small project, a single site in the Bronx, where a community garden organization had surplus land and no budget for the structure they needed. One of her colleagues had brought it to her in March, with the apologetic tone of someone proposing something too small for a woman of her background. And she had looked at the site plan for about 30 seconds and said, "Give me the week," and had spent the week designing something that was beautiful and buildable and designed specifically for children whose bodies and minds learned through movement with sensory elements and varied textures and structures that accommodated children with different physical needs. She had designed it thinking about Leo. She had not acknowledged this to herself until the design was finished, and then she had sat with it for a while and acknowledged it and kept the design because it was good, and because the reason it was good was inseparable from the person who had inspired it. She needed a contractor. She had known this for 2 months. She had priced 3 other firms, and they were all workable, and none of them were right, and she had known why none of them were right, and she had not let herself act on the knowing until a Tuesday morning in early May, when she woke up and the trees outside her window were fully green, and she understood that she had been patient long enough, and that patience held past its purpose became something else. She rolled the blueprints. She put on her coat, the comfortable one, the wool one that she had bought in March, and that her former communications director would have described as a significant departure from brand, and she picked up the blueprints and her canvas bag, and she took the subway to Brooklyn. The shop was the same. Of course it was the same. It was a woodshop in Red Hook, run by a man who built things to last, and 4 months was not enough time to change the high windows, or the wall of tools, or the smell of beeswax and linseed oil that reached her when she pushed the wooden doors open and stepped inside. Elias was at the central workbench. He was working a piece of cherry wood with a card scraper, and the sound it made was a clean, high whisper, and he looked up when she came in the way he had always looked up, with the full, unhurried attention that was entirely his own. And for a moment they simply looked at each other across the length of the shop, across the sawdust and the morning light, and the 4 months and everything that had happened inside them, and neither of them spoke. He looked different, not in any way she could have described to someone else. He looked like himself, which she had learned to read well enough to see the places where himself had been tested. There were lines around his eyes that she did not think were new, but that she saw more clearly now. He had been tested, and he was still standing, and she had known he would be because she had never met anyone who stood the way Elias Thorne stood, not with rigidity, but with the deep-rooted steadiness of something that had grown in place. She walked to the central workbench. She unrolled the blueprints. She smoothed them with both hands, the way he smoothed his materials attending to them, and she did not look up at him while she did this because she needed one more moment before she looked at his face again. "My firm is working on a playground," she said. "A community structure for underprivileged children in the Bronx. Sensory elements, varied textures built for children with different learning and physical needs." She kept her eyes on the blueprints. "I need a lead contractor, someone who understands wood, someone who builds things that last." Now she looked up. "I don't have a Vance budget anymore. I have a nonprofit budget and materials costs and a timeline that is not negotiable because the community organization has a spring installation date." She held his gaze and kept her voice steady. "Are you interested?" Elias looked at the blueprints. He looked at them the way he looked at everything, with the full patient attention of a man who understood that what he was looking at deserved to be seen properly. She watched his eyes move across the plans, across the sensory wall she had designed along the eastern edge. The climbing structure with its varied grip surfaces, the low platform area with the smooth curved wood that she had specified in her notes as being specifically suitable for children who needed to regulate through touch. He was quiet for a long time. "The sensory wall," he said. "You've specified reclaimed oak for the primary surface." "Yes. The grain variation in reclaimed oak will give you better tactile range than new cut," he said. "But the weathering is inconsistent. You'll need to hand finish each panel individually." "I know," she said. "That's why I need someone who does handwork." He looked at the blueprint for another moment. Then he looked at her. His face was still complicated. She did not expect it to be uncomplicated. 4 months was not enough time, and a playground blueprint was not a resolution of everything the file on his workbench had contained, and she was not here to offer resolution. She was here because she had a project that needed his hands, and because she had been honest about that from the beginning with herself and now with him. "The legal process," he said. "Is moving," she said. "The fund is established. The firm handling your case is independent of anything connected to me. I made that a condition of the structure. What happens legally is yours. I have no involvement in how you proceed." He was quiet again. "Victoria," he said. And it was the first time he had said her name since February, since the shop in winter with the file on the workbench between them, and the sound of it in his voice was different now, not warmer exactly, but more textured the way wood was more textured when it had been worked and finished. "I know," she said. And she did know. She knew it was not resolved. She knew the gap between where they had been in December and where they were standing now was not bridgeable in a morning in May with a set of blueprints on a workbench. She knew that what she was offering was not a restored version of what they had been, but a new thing, smaller and more honest with its foundations visible instead of hidden. "I'm not the same person who walked in here in October," she said. "I'm not asking you to trust that person. I'm asking you to look at the work." She touched the edge of the blueprint. "Just the work. For now." Elias looked at the plans. He reached out and picked up a pencil from the cup at the edge of the workbench, and he turned it in his hand the way he turned everything before he committed to it. And then he leaned over the blueprint and traced a line along the sensory wall, the one she had specified in reclaimed oak, and he said, "The panel joints here. You've got them at 90 degrees. For a children's sensory surface, you want a slight bevel, maybe 5 degrees, so there's no sharp edge transition when a child runs their hand across." Victoria looked at the line he had drawn. She picked up her own pencil and made a note. "Show me," she said. And he did. He spent the next 40 minutes at the workbench with her moving through the blueprint section by section, and she watched his hands on the plans and listened to the language he used, which was the language of someone who had spent his life understanding how things worked when they were touched by human beings, how structures behaved when children climbed them and leaned on them and discovered them with their bodies. He talked about wood the way he had always talked about wood, as if it had preferences, as if the material itself had something to contribute to the design if you were willing to ask it. She wrote everything down. Outside the shop, Red Hook was doing what it did in May, waking up slowly into warmth, the street taking on the particular quality of a Brooklyn neighborhood in early spring, the light coming in at a low gold angle that made everything look briefly and improbably like something being remembered rather than something happening. She heard the feet on the stairs before the door opened. Leo came into the shop at the speed of a child who had heard something from upstairs that required immediate investigation, which was apparently the sound of a familiar voice. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at Victoria with his father's directness, and something else. Something that was entirely his own, a careful assessing warmth that was the specific warmth of a child who had learned that some people needed to earn their welcome, and that earning it was a process worth taking seriously. He was taller. She noticed this immediately and with a sharpness she did not expect. 4 months of a child's growth was not nothing. He was taller, and his hair was slightly longer, and he was wearing a shirt she had not seen before, a green one with a Brooklyn Botanic Garden logo on it, and she wondered who had taken him there and what he had looked at, and whether he had brought his notebook. He walked across the shop. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her face with the judicial seriousness she had first seen on a Brooklyn bridge at 6 in the morning over a ruined birthday cake, and she looked back at him and did not try to manage the expression on her own face, which was something she was still learning. "You were gone a long time," Leo said. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." Leo considered this the way he considered everything seriously and without hurry. "My dad says sometimes people have to go away to figure out how to come back right," he said. Victoria looked across the workbench at Elias, who was looking at the blueprint again, with a slight deliberateness that suggested he was giving her and his son the moment without inserting himself into it. "Your dad," she said, "is a very wise man." "I know," Leo said with the simple total conviction of a child who had never doubted this for a single day of his life. Then he crossed the remaining distance between them and put his arms around her waist and pressed his face against her coat, and she felt his small, warm solidity against her, and she put both hands on his back and held on. And for a moment the shop was very quiet, and the morning light moved across the sawdust on the floor, and the tools hung in their places on the wall, and the wood on the workbench waited with its grain and its patience for whatever would be made of it. Elias looked up from the blueprint. He looked at his son and at Victoria and at the space between them, which was not empty now, and he picked up the pencil and made a note in the margin of the plans, a small notation in the careful architectural handwriting of a man who measured twice and built things to last. "Material costs," he said, without looking up, "are on you." "Yes," she said. Her voice came out slightly unsteady, and she did not try to correct it. "Labor," he said. And now he looked up, and his eyes were the steady dark eyes she had known since October, but with something in them now that had not been there in October, something that had been there in December by a fire and had survived February and spring and everything in between, and was still there quieter now and more certain the way things were, more certain when they had been tested, is paid in family dinners. Leo pulled back and looked up at her. "Can you cook?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. "That's okay, Leo said. "My dad can teach you. He taught me. It's not that hard." Elias shook his head, once a small movement that carried in it everything he was not yet saying, and looked back at the blueprints, and the ghost of something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was the shape that a smile came from the deep underlying shape of a man who had once been broken by the world and had rebuilt himself from the materials available, which was, in the end, the most skilled carpentry of all. Victoria stood in the woodshop in the May morning with Leo's warmth still in her hands and the blueprint spread on the workbench and the smell of beeswax and sawdust around her like something she had known for a long time, and she felt with a clarity that required no management and no performance and no architecture of any kind that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because she had earned it cleanly, not because the account was settled and the debt was paid and everything was resolved in the way that things resolved neatly in stories about people who deserved neat resolutions, but because she had told the truth when the truth was the most expensive thing she had, and she had walked out into the cold and kept walking, and spring had come anyway, the way spring always came, not as a reward, but as a continuation, the world moving forward in its patient, indifferent way, offering another morning to anyone still standing in it. She pulled up a stool and sat down at the workbench. She picked up her pencil. Outside Brooklyn moved through its morning, and the light came through the high windows of Thorn and Son woodworks in long golden planes, and it fell across the blueprints and the tools and the sawdust, and the two people bent over the plans, and the small boy who had climbed onto his stool at his own bench in the back and opened his notebook to a new page. Leo picked up his pencil. He looked at the new page for a moment, and then he began to draw.